Our Old Testament reading this morning comes to us from Exodus 17, beginning in verse 1. Listen now and hear the word of God. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages, as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Have you ever had one of those days? You know the kind I'm talking about. The one where you wake up half an hour late, bolt for the bathroom, only to discover that the earlier rising members of your household have generously managed to drain every drop of hot water from the tank. The one where you stumble to your fridge and open it up and find that what you had prepared for your children's lunch has been consumed by said children the night before. Oh, and you've come from a frigid shower, by the way, into an equally icy kitchen, so cold you begin to suspect that the furnace has ceased to function during the night. That is, until you discover that someone has left the back door open. Again, all night long. The dog wants in, the cat wants out. One of your children has just thrown up, and another one appears to have broken out in a suspicious-looking rash. The coffee pot's empty, the laundry basket's full, and just about the time you manage to get the last entirely healthy member of your tribe bundled into the car, wearing a pair of mismatched socks and his sister's coat, he nonchalantly reminds you this is your day to provide gluten-free, seasonally themed snacks for the entire 4th grade. But don't worry, you won't need to drop them off before noon. By this time, you're so exhausted that the only thing you want to do is go back to bed. And it's not even 8 a.m. One of those days. We all have them, don't we? Fortunately, the mayhem is usually relatively minor, blessedly short-lived. Occasionally, though, one of those days stretches into 2. A week, a month, with no end in sight. The illness is serious. The bank account is empty. The crisis is real. And when true disaster strikes, it has a funny way of sweeping whole families or communities or congregations along in its wake. Now, I don't know about you all, but the good folks back at New Providence certainly know about that. A few years back, we had what can probably best be described as a December to remember. Though to be honest, it was one that most of us would just as soon forget. In a season already notorious for its ability to try the physical and emotional limits of congregations and churches alike, that particular Advent truly was one for the record books. We knew it was the season for stars and shepherds, tidings of great joy and goodwill to all. It's a good story. A lot of us can probably quote it by heart. But somehow all of that just seemed so there and then, when that year it was all we could do to deal with here and now. The excitement of that terrifyingly memorable December kicked off with the plague of sickness. Bronchitis, strep, walking pneumonia ran rampant. Stomach flu, bird flu, swine flu, you name it, we had it. Disease and pestilence were soon followed by an alarming array of fiscal and facilities fiascos, which included a budget that refused to be balanced, and for 3 solid weeks, a fire alarm that defied every attempt to be repaired or turned off. The new roof sprang a leak, then 2, then 3, and the rain just kept on coming. The final straw was 3 funerals in 2 weeks. We dutifully recited the scripture, "They shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us, with more than just a little bit of skepticism. Convinced that the only one with us that year was the angel of death, we staggered through Christmas shell-shocked and exhausted, sick to death of death and tragedy and pain and suffering, terrified to ask what's next, for fear we just might find out. It's a sentiment which I am quite certain those Israelite refugees could relate. Now, the truth is, sometimes bad stuff just happens. It's one of the less enchanting parts of what is often euphemistically referred to as the human condition. But when disaster strikes and there's no discernible end or obvious source of assistance in sight, it doesn't take long for even the most faithful among us to ask, is the Lord among us or not? With Exodus, we have the benefit of knowing the rest of the story. But just take a minute to stop and consider what it might have been like to be in those Israelite sandals without privy to such useful information. As Walter Brueggemann points out, God delivered Israel not into the promised land, but into the wilderness. Sure, they were free. They also had no food, no water, and as far as they could tell, they were lost in the middle of nowhere. In that kind of context, even bondage can start to look pretty attractive. Where we see God's guidance, protection, and provision, they saw abandonment, danger, and starvation. Is it any wonder they were ready to head back to Egypt? With the perspective of an omniscient narrator on our side, it's easy for us to see the Israelites as nothing more than a bunch of ungrateful whiners. They've been rescued from slavery, for crying out loud. They're going to the promised land, eventually. And in the meantime, all they have to do is camp out for a few years or a few decades while God feeds them with water from rocks, all the poultry their hearts could desire, some weird stuff that they have to gather up off the ground in the morning that no one can really identify, but apparently it tastes pretty good. Like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey, Exodus 16 tells us. We know that God is there, that God has a plan, and that everything will turn out just fine in the end. But from the Israelites' point of view, things don't seem quite that promising or quite that simple. We read the story and see a faithful servant in frequent, intimate communication with a God who is always present and prepared to provide for the people's every need. The Israelites see a grouchy old former Egyptian prince turned criminal, turned shepherd, turned self-proclaimed prophet, claiming to be hearing from a God who might or might not actually be there. We look at the rock at Horeb and see the place where God stands, ready to provide relief for the thirsty people. The Israelites look and they see a rock. Perspective does make a difference, doesn't it? At 7:51 on the morning of Friday, January 12, 2007, the middle of the morning rush hour, a man emerged from the train into a Washington, D.C. metro station and positioned himself against a wall beside a trash basket. By most measures, he was nondescript, a youngish white guy wearing jeans, a long-sleeve t-shirt, and Washington Nationals baseball cap. From a small case, he removed a violin, placing the open case at his feet. He shrewdly threw in a few dollars in pocket change as seed money, swiveled it to face the pedestrian traffic, and began to play. With acrobatic enthusiasm, he leaned into the music, arching on tiptoes at the high notes. The sound was nearly symphonic, carrying to all parts of the arcade as the pedestrian traffic filed past. 3 minutes went by before anything happened. 63 people had already passed when a middle-aged man altered his gait for a split second, turning his head to notice that there seemed to be some guy playing music. But he didn't stop. A half minute later, though, the musician got his first donation. A woman threw in a buck and scooted off. It was not until 6 minutes into the performance that someone actually stood against a wall and listened. Things never got much better. In 43 minutes, the violinist performed 6 classical pieces. 1,097 people passed by. 7 stopped what they were doing to hang around and take in the performance, at least for a minute. 27 gave money, most of them on the run, for a total of $32 and change. There was never a crowd, not even for a second. To be fair, the presence of the violinist was a familiar sight to commuters in an urban area where the occasional street performer is part of the cityscape. The thing was, though, this musician was no ordinary busker. His name was Joshua Bell, arguably the most talented classical violinist in the world. A one-time child prodigy, at 39, Bell had arrived as an internationally acclaimed virtuoso. 3 days before he appeared at the metro station, Bell had filled the house at Boston's stately Symphony Hall, where merely pretty good seats went for $100. 2 weeks later, at the Music Center at Strathmore in North Bethesda, he would play to a standing room-only audience, so respectful of his artistry that they stifled their coughs until the silence between movements. But on that Friday in January, Joshua Bell was just another beggar competing for the attention of busy people on their way to work. Perspective does make a difference, doesn't it? Perhaps few people in the entire course of history have been more anxious for a sign of God's presence among them than the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And few have likely been more skeptical when the long-awaited presence actually arrived. Sure, they were looking for the coming of the Messiah. This Jesus from Nazareth was not what they had expected at all. And if possible, his crazy cousin John was even less credible. When Jesus asked, was John's ministry from God? Or was he just a strong personality who held sway over the crowds? Religious leaders rightly recognized this for the impossible situation that it was. If they say that John was just a magnetic figure with human powers of persuasion, then the people who viewed John as one in a long line of great prophets would be incensed. On the other hand, if they respond that John was on a mission from God, so to speak, then the people would justifiably want to know why they, as keepers of the religious tradition, had not followed this divinely ordained prophet. There is, from the religious officials' point of view, no right or safe answer. So they wisely decide that the best option is to simply keep their mouths shut. Now, it's pretty easy for us to be hard on the priest and elders. But let's be honest. A fur-wearing, bug-eating, raving, potential lunatic, a religious fanatic with an uncanny gift for provoking the powers that be, isn't the kind of person who generally endears themselves to the religious establishment. We have the distinct advantage of 2,000 years of hindsight and the New Revised Standard Version on our side. But something tells me, if old John turned up here on a Sunday morning claiming he'd come to deliver a message from the Almighty, we'd be more likely to escort him to the nearest mental health facility and show him into the pulpit. Perspective makes a difference. For thirsty refugees lost in the wilderness, harried commuters going about their daily routine, for ancient Jews and modern Presbyterians desperate for assurance that God is indeed with us, when from a strictly human point of view, everything around us suggests otherwise. Here's the thing, though. The Lord really is among us. Even when that divine presence looks nothing like what we expected. Even when our own pain and suffering and busyness make it all but impossible to see it at all. Make no mistake, stuff still happens. The human condition is still all too human. But the good news is that in the midst of everything that blurs our vision and skews our perspective, God is with us. In the form of ex-princes, shepherds, crazy prophets. In the person of an itinerant carpenter preacher who says, "Blessed are those with eyes to see and ears to hear. And you shall call him Emmanuel." Thanks be to the God who is with us.